done an overview of the prophets, and we saw they had two primary responsibilities. They looked out into the future through God's grace and mercy, and through God's Spirit, and prophesied about events in the future. But actually, primarily, they interpreted their own surroundings through the lens of the Torah and the Lord's covenants. And this leads us to the first major prophet, not because he's more important, but because his book is so big. And that is the prophet Isaiah. Now, I must admit, I'm really biased toward Isaiah. If I could preach on one Old Testament book, it would be Leviticus. Second would probably be Genesis, and the third would probably be Isaiah. And we'll see why here in a moment. He is so significant. So let's go ahead and get started here. The book of Isaiah. So we can see Isaiah records a series of visions that cover about a 50-year period. That's a significant amount of time, right? And these visions, they climax in the hope of the Messiah, the suffering servant, whom we'll talk about here in just a little bit, and the new heavens and the new earth. And you can see where the Apostle John picks up the new heavens and the new earth. Now, chronologically, as I just said, the vision of Isaiah, it covers about 50 years, and it ranges the span of 4 kings. So you have King Uzziah. Now, I don't, he's probably not prophesying during that entire time period, because that'd probably be too much there. But you have Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So Isaiah has a really rich prophetical ministry that spans multiple kings, some good, maybe some not as good. And he's a very significant figure, Isaiah. So let's go ahead and think about kind of big picture here, what's going on in Isaiah. And I wish I can talk more about this, but here we are. So, though the book of Isaiah highlights Israel's sin and pending exile, Yahweh ensures through the prophet Isaiah that his promise to David remains intact. Now, I want to take this and break it apart just a little bit. From the beginning of Isaiah, the prophet is really clear that Israel is in sin. Very clear. They don't do justice, they don't do righteousness, they do evil. Their offerings are covered in blood, metaphorically. And because of this, there is going to be judgment that comes their way. So, Isaiah the prophet is very clear about that. Yet, there are these little nuggets of hope scattered throughout the book. And those nuggets of hope come back to this original promise that we've talked about in 2 Samuel 7 through David. Now, what exactly does this entail? So, the second point here is, so Israel's in sin, and there is 2 kingdoms at this point, right? Northern and southern kingdom. With all of this, Yahweh, the God of Israel, he promises to send a Messiah who will make all things right. So we see, for example, in Isaiah 11, there is this hope that there's a stump, there's a branch, right? I love the agricultural imagery of Jesse. Now, who is Jesse? I'll let you think about that for a second, right? As I drink my delicious coffee here. Who is Jesse? If you answered the father of David, then you are correct. Isaiah 11, for it to speak of the branch stump of Jesse, that is to say, there is going to be someone from the line of David who is going to come. There's still the promise remains, right? And this climaxes in Isaiah 42 through 53, where we have here the hope of the servant, the suffering servant, the hope of the son. This is what we see in Isaiah 53. Surely he, speaking of this servant who's going to come on behalf of the Lord, surely he, the servant, has borne our grief and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So try to put yourself in the sandals of Isaiah here, right? So he's prophesying in the 7th century, and he looks around and he sees iniquity all around him. And the Lord gives him this promise that is really the climax of his book, that although the people are in sin, there is going to be a servant on behalf of the Lord who is going to come, and he's essentially going to experience the judgment and the destruction that the people deserve. But in that, he is going to bring healing to his people. He's going to bring them peace, and with his own wounds, the people will be healed. There's this beautiful hope in Isaiah. In the midst of sin and chaos, there is hope. And that hope is this person who's going to come from the line of David, who is going to be a servant or a son of the Lord, and they're going to make all things right. So who could that be then? That's the $1 billion question. Who is this Messiah, this anointed person who's going to make all things right? And that leads us then to our takeaway here from the book of Isaiah. Proto-evangelium. We talked about this already. Genesis 3:15, the first gospel, that's what proto-evangelium means. And there's this promise of this seed from the line of Eve who's going to come and crush the head of the serpent, though he himself is going to be bruised. When we read Isaiah 42 through 53, in my opinion, the language between the two is so obvious. Isaiah is being given this promise that, hey, there's going to be a person who comes and he's going to do what Genesis 3:15 said he would do. He's going to be crushed under the iniquity of God. And I know in Genesis 3:15 it's a little bit different. It's more so Satan himself doing the fighting. But the picture is clear here. There's going to be one in Isaiah 42 through 53 who is going to suffer the iniquity and injustice of his own people. And when you read the Gospels, when you read the New Testament, they pick this up. And Jesus himself says this about himself, but especially his followers, the New Testament writers. And they look at Jesus and they say, there is no doubt that the suffering servant of Isaiah in the 7th century is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He is the one who bore the iniquity of his people to heal them. This is what Peter writes to churches dispersed all throughout the Mediterranean world. He says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it? When you sin and are beaten for it, you endure. But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving an example so that you might follow in his steps." Now I'm going to pause right there. So Peter's saying, hey, servants, be subject to those who are over you. And so that's the clear instruction here. And then he explains why. He says, hey, it's good when someone suffers. Like if someone suffers for doing good, that's okay, right? And then he says in verse 21, well, Jesus did this also. And then he expands on this a little bit more. Verse 22, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Peter's words here are very clear. He tells people, hey, be like Jesus, and let me tell you how Jesus was. And in doing that, in verses 22 and 25, 22 through 25, there is this clear connection between the servant in Isaiah and Jesus. In the same way the servant is going to give himself over for his people, Jesus has given himself over for his people. In other words, Jesus is the proto-evangelium fulfillment. He is the Davidic fulfillment. He is the fulfillment of the suffering servant. All of those things are intertwined together. It's a beautiful picture. And I just want you to think about that for a second here. The significance of Jesus being the fulfillment of a 700-year prophecy. And with that, we're going to go ahead and move now from the book of Isaiah to the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is going to only double down further on what Isaiah is saying here. Let's go ahead and turn there.